Hi, good evening. Welcome to Author's Talk by Trishna, part 2 of the story Shadow in the Dark. Let's begin. At Wildflower Hall, Pa was a bundle of nerves. It was past 11:30 and there was no sign of Nandi. There was no way to check on him. The deadly amalgamation of his anxiety and anger were reaching the peak. It's typical of Nandi, this careless attitude. He has probably missed the bus, but wouldn't think of informing. Pa tried resting his anxiety. He had booked a trunk call, but it hadn't come through either. There was no answer from the other side. He was told. Alarming thoughts were invading his mind, one after the other. He was nervous, but ordered all to retire for the night. Unable to sleep, he just sat on the chair in the drawing room, brooding, his forehead wrinkled in a deep frown. He knew the geology of the region well, knew of frequent landslides and sudden falling boulders. The road itself was not good condition. All should be well with Nandi, he prayed. After a long wait, finally he went to his bedroom for the restless night. However much Nandi tried to sleep, he just couldn't. The incident that had taken place around this area kept hovering in his mind like an obstinate fly. He raised his head to glance around. Except for Desraj, all had tightly wrapped their blankets around and were restlessly shifting inside their makeshift cocoons. The driver and the conductor sat in the front cabin chatting softly. Desraj sat cross-legged on his seat with eyes closed and was mumbling continually. Nandi was gratified that someone was trying to keep them safe through his ardent prayers. He felt sad for the bus crew's tough job. He could well imagine their plight, how terrifying it must be when they were often forced to spend nights like this, stranded in such lonely environs. Their act of bravery was taken for granted, whereas their courage to commitment called for accolades. Without a blanket, Nandi was shivering in cold. He took out his jacket from his bag, buttoning it up. He wrapped his muffler around his neck and once again activated his efforts to sleep. Then he almost fell off his seat, hearing a sound he had been longing for. It was getting closer at last. He sat up and looked around. All heads had popped up, listening to the blissful sound of an approaching vehicle. He shouted at everyone to get off the bus. Help had arrived. No way should they miss the chance. Jumping out of his seat, he ran to open the door before Bhim Singh could emerge from the cabin. He shot out of the door and on the road. Bhim Singh followed him. One by one, others secured out like a nest of mice from a hole. They could see the lights of a vehicle a few curves away. They must stop at all cost. The conductor rushed to climb up the roof of the bus, where bulky luggage was kept, and threw down the sacks. Nandi and others arranged them on the road to form a barricade. They were not sure the vehicle would stop otherwise. The driver might get scared, taking them to be some wandering spirits. Thanks to all the prevalent ghost stories in the area, Bhim Singh stood with the torch, shining it on their hurriedly constructed barricade. He wanted to make sure that the approaching vehicle did not miss it. That will be catastrophic for the owners of the sacks and perhaps for the vehicle. They were wrong. The truck stopped as soon as the driver spotted the stranded bus and its passengers, even before spotting the barricade. It was an army truck. The relief was immense. The smiles of respite brightened all the faces. There was immediate and brisk activity. Many ran to find hidden nooks to pee. Nandi smiled, realizing the parallels in human nature. Each person then promptly picked up his luggage and one by one boarded the truck. The driver and the conductor too rushed to bring their stuff. They locked the bus and dashed back. "You both are coming too?" Nandi asked, surprised. Weren't they recanting from their earlier statement? Yes, we'll shift to Narkanda for the night, Bhim Singh said, flashing a gratifying grin. Ram Prasad added, "We'll get back in the morning with the mechanics and get the bus repaired to towed, whatever." And they both hesitantly hopped into the back of the truck where others were already merrily seated. Nandi was given the honor of sitting in front, next to the driver. Thus, with loud, heartfelt thanks offered to the Lord for helping them escape the trauma of spending the night in the lonely hinterland, the onward journey commenced. Sandwiched between the driver and his helper, Nandi felt much relieved. He checked the time. It was 5 minutes past 11. Bhai must have lodged the missing person report by now. "So you're headed for Shimla?" he asked the driver. "Ji sir ji, to our cantonment in Jutogar. I need to go to a place much before Shimla. It's called the Charabra. Do you know it?" "Yes, of course, but there is nothing much there except a few famous buildings. The retreat where the VIPs stays in summers. I once drove the ADC to the Prime Minister Pandit Nehru there. I was his driver before I was transferred. Then there is a famous building on top of the hill called Wildflower Hall," he announced proudly. "Great, yaar. What luck. You know the place? Wildflower Hall? That's exactly where I need to go. My brother lives there. He's waiting for me. Must be worried sick by now. Perhaps he's on his way to the police station," Nandi declared with a laugh. The driver smiled. "I don't think there's a police station close by, so do not worry." Then he added seriously, "We'll reach there pretty late." "Do you often drive late at night?" "Gee, very often." What time do you expect to reach?" "Should be at my cantonment a little after 3. "And at Wildflower Hall?" The driver did some quick calculations and declared, "By 2 or perhaps a little after." Nandi was not at all alarmed. He felt so blissful at this deliverance that he fell into a friendly chat with the driver. The turbaned Sikh replied to Nandi's query, "Sarji, I am Narinder Singh." "What a coincidence, yaar." Nandi gave a broad grin and patted Narendra Singh's shoulder. Narendra comes to the rescue of Narendra. The young driver and his helper chuckled. You know, Narendra Singh, if you hadn't come our way tonight to our rescue, I wouldn't have slept a wink. All these people traveling with me in the bus tried their best to scare me to death. They told me such unbelievable tales of female ghosts seeking bachelor mates that for some time I was afraid I will be visited by one being a bachelor myself. But I don't blame them. They are simple, innocent people and highly superstitious. I don't blame them either, sir. Narendra Singh quickly glanced at Nandi and then focused his attention back on the road. The area is such. For miles and miles around their villages, there's nothing but wilderness. And it's an accident prone area. There have been many accidents and untimely deaths. I take special care to drive very vigilantly here. In fact, only best of the army drivers get to drive on this highway, the Hindustan Tibet Road. He glanced sideways and smiled, seeing Nandi nodding and looking at him admiringly. As far as being superstitious is concerned, I am not very sure of that either. You wouldn't believe what happened with us last month when we were driving through this wilderness one night. Don't tell me you too met a ghost. Nandi's distressed cry was rather comical. Narendra Singh smiled and then added gravely, Yes, sir. I even reported the incident to my superiors. We in the army are trained to be rough and tough, but that toughness is limited to dealing with other human beings. We are not trained to deal with ghosts. You met a ghost? When? Where? Nandi wanted to avoid discussion, but this curiosity clouded his common sense. Moreover, his present seat between two robust young army chaps gave him a great sense of security. Sir, only last month I was driving through this trench, through the opposite direction towards the Indo-China border. It was have been around 1 o'clock at night. We had crossed Rampur and had barely driven for about 15 minutes in the desolate country, where even a young man would think twice to venture out alone, when we were surprised to see a woman crossing the road all by herself. Her long loose hair was blowing as if in strong blasts of wind. But, sir, there was hardly a breeze at that time. My window was open and I felt no draught. Her flimsy loose camise too was similarly fluttering. Her sudden appearance startled me so much that I forgot to apply the brake. She didn't bother that a truck was heading straight towards her, might even crush her, and even calmly continued to walk across the road, unmindful not even a glance in our direction. Narendra Singh audibly blew out a puff of breath and then shook his head. Very strange, Nandi commented and peered through the truck's windshield. By now, the half moon was light high up, washing the landscape in its soft light, making it appear like a vast haunted land. And Sergi, she walked on as if in a trance. I managed to break just inches from her. Otherwise, she would have been under the wheels of my truck. My legs were shivering. I had just averted a mishap and saved my job, I thought. Ask Ashok. He was with me that night too. How he shrieked. Then we both sat stunned, staring at her. Nandi turned to see Ashok's reaction. He was nodding his head convincingly. Nandi applied his logic yet again. Why Narendra Singh? She could possibly a woman from this area, from a nearby village who had to be out that hour to perhaps contact a doctor in the forest? Where not even a shack exists. Narendra Singh brushed off Nandi's statement. Ashok added mellifluously, doctors don't open their dispensaries in the jungles in the middle of the night. Moreover, she was totally unaware of a truck heading straight at her, completely unmindful. Feeling a bit sheepish, Nandi scanned the lonely forsaken land then. I parked my truck on site and called out her, asking if she needed help. She paid me no heed, didn't even turn to acknowledge our presence. After crossing the road, she began to climb down the hill with ease, just like walking down the steps. Ashok and I jumped down our vehicle. I admire that. I wouldn't have dared. Nandi whispered. He peered outside as if he might confront her right then. I again called out to her louder. Can we help you, lady? Where are you going this late? She didn't respond as if she had neither seen nor heard us. She kept on climbing down the hillside, slowly, steadily, and then disappeared completely from our sight. I ran to peep down, to see where she was going. Meanwhile, Ashok fetched a torch and we peered down the hillside. There was no sign of her anywhere. Sir, you won't believe us. The hillside was a straight and steep wall, not possible to climb down the way she was doing, like a climbing down steps. The steep hillside ended directly into the Satluj. There was no pathway, no habitation in that direction, nothing at all. And we realized that we had encountered something supernatural. She wasn't living woman. We both were frightened out of our wits. Ashok began to shiver. Ashok nodded. Even confronting an enemy in a battlefield couldn't have frightened me more. Narendra continued. We both ran back to the truck and I raced my vehicle away from there. I still wonder about her. Sarji, she wasn't a woman under a spell or out for a tantric ritual. She was definitely a ghost. The way she disappeared. Nandi wiped his brows and remained silent. There was no scope for contesting his soldier's statement. Narendra Singh went on. We barely took a few seconds to reach the roadside to peep down after she went down there. The were barren and rocky, not covered with any trees or vegetation to obstruct our view. There was no place to hide, and it was impossible to go down that straight wall, not without ropes and proper mountain climbing equipment. Nandi nodded thoughtfully. He could envision the steep rock. It was impossible to walk down the way. Narendra Singh was describing even if the wall was inclined. Nandi could feel Ashok shivering. Pakka, she was a ghost, he whispered. Nandi glanced at the young man in the army uniform who now sat with his eyes closed, muttering prayers. It was unnerving to see fright on the face of a strong army chap. Nandi felt a frisson of fear creep into him. You know, Sarji, I have been avoiding driving at night since then. Never believed in ghosts till that day. But ever since, he paused, gripping the steering wheel. Today I had to travel at night due to some urgent deliveries. Orders are orders, can't refuse them. All the time I had prayers in my heart that we shouldn't have to experience the spooky spirit again. Nandi noted the army man's tensed facial muscles with trepidation. Narendra Singh shook his head. Seeing all of you stranded in this desolated jungle, I was glad that Vaheguru had sent me to your rescue. I am also glad for the company. With all of you in my truck today, I am very comfortable. Didn't you mistake us for ghosts? Nandi laughed, and so did Narendra Singh. No, sir, it was the broken down bus that gave the surety that you all were not ghosts. Haven't heard of a ghost bus yet, he cackled. Anybody alone in this forlorn surroundings could easily begin to imagine things hallucinating, as science explains, thought Nandi. But it shouldn't happen to strong soldiers, to the men trained to protect the nation. Their experience with a ghost woman was disturbing but seemed genuine. The truck's headlights were hacking through the darkness, revealing a few meters of an intensely desolate road. Nandi's eyes penetrated through the surroundings, the visible and the obscure. Maybe he might get to see a ghost too. It would be interesting to encounter one. With these two strong soldiers with him and 9 men huddled at the back, this was not a bad time for such an experience. Nandi smiled at his childish thought and chose to change the topic. So tell me about your life in the army, Narendra Singh. Is it too hard? Oh, yes, sir. We are made rough and tough through vigorous and strict routine. After all, we have to be very ready to defend our borders. Ours is a new nation. Barely 9 years old, we are just trying to stand on our feet. Why would anyone want to invade us? We are the beginners, that's exactly why. There could be sharks around, ready to swallow our lands, wanting to feed on our weakness. They got engrossed in the discussion and soon they reached Rampur Bushehr. The town was a ghost town at this hour of night. Not even a small tea shop was open. The road was uphill from here all the way till Narkanda. The truck moved up slowly through the shadows of giant conifers and the speckled moonlight filtering through them. Animated discussions kept them alert and busy. They reached Narkanda where they stopped to drop Ramprasad and Bhim Singh. After the thanks, goodbyes, and promises to meet again, the journey continued. Sitting next to the driver, Nandi knew that he was supposed to keep awake for his sake. Although his eyes were heavy with sleep, he kept conversation alive. They talked about their families, country affairs, and the terrible massacre following the partition in 1947 that was so fresh on their minds. In northern India, everyone's close to distant families, directly or indirectly, seemed to have been affected by the horrific bloodbath. But they totally avoiding discussing anything spooky again. Hours passed quickly for Nandi. They were still engrossed in an animated exchange when the truck halted once again in complete wilderness. Nandi looked at the driver inquiringly. Your destination, sir, announced Narinder Singh. Nandi looked around. There was nothing in the vicinity apart from a dense coniferous forest. There was absolute zilch. There weren't even any street lights to indicate habitation. Is this army driver playing a prank on me? He has been behaving absolutely normal, but now he wants me to get off in the middle of nowhere in the forest. He looked at Narinder Singh with the anxiety writ large on his face. Narinder Singh nodded and pointed at a path ascending uphill, dimly visible in the light of the half moon. He was also quick to grasp Nandi's nervousness. Patting his back, the driver consoled him. The building you want to reach is just a few curves ahead. I have been there with my friends, thou at daytime. Beautiful place. If you walk fast, which of course you will, you should be there in less than 10 minutes. Nandi had no choice but to trust the helpful men. He picked up his bag and hopped down. The other travelers at the back of the truck were blissful sleeping. He heard their soft snores, not wanting to disturb them. He extended his heartfelt thanks to Narinder Singh and Ashok. After the quick adieux, he watched the truck move further and further away from him. He stood watching with dismay, the truck lights becoming dim and then totally disappearing down the road and around a curve. Once the truck was gone, Nandi was engulfed by the dark, lonely night. He peered at his watch. He couldn't read the time. There wasn't enough light. He had kept his torch in the bag and didn't want to waste time opening it. He guessed it was around 2, the time he had estimated. By now, his eyes had adjusted to the dim light, which was enough for walking up the path. He surveyed the deserted surroundings with unease. The path going up was metalled, broad enough for a small vehicle like a jeep to ply. This could be the place. His brother had mentioned it being lonely. Sighing deeply, he reminded himself that he was wasting time standing here and brooding. What needs to be done must be done. With long strides, he approached the path. A few monkeys, abruptly disturbed out of their sleep, rushed up the branches, chattering noisily. They were clearly making an attempt to increase their distance from the ground. More abrupt, fluttering movements up on a tree followed, high above, almost at the top. A flying squirrel screeched and took a sudden agitated flight, gliding down far into the dark valley. An owl hooted from inside a cluster of trees. Then the intense silence returned. Though all the disturbances had made Nandi jumpy, the silence made him more nervous. He looked up at the tall deodar trees and smiled at his foolishness. The forest creatures were not used to having human company at this odd hour of night. He gradually brought his vision back to the path he was to tread. And then his heartbeat suddenly stopped. He stood rooted to the ground, frozen, paralyzed. A strange woman stood on the side of the path, staring at him. Faint moonlight fell on her face, giving it a strange glow, like light passing through a transparent film. She looked stunning, almost out of this world. Nandi swallowed hard and gathered his wits. Who's she? What's she doing here in the dead of the night? Who's she waiting for? Is she crazy? Is she a prostitute? Will she find customers here in this wilderness? He tried his best to keep out the frightful question lingering at the back of his mind. He dismissed his fear by deciding that she was a local woman of area. He looked around once again to locate some houses or hutments but failed. He had added a strong reason now to hurry to reach his destination. In long strides he passed by there. The moment he did that, he felt an icy cold draught hit his body, like a cold breath of a grave. The long night had slowed down his reaction, and he passed by her without any further thought. He began to climb the path. I've ignored her completely. Good enough. Reason that she should return home. After about 10 steps, he glanced back to check on her. Out of curiosity, she was no longer standing at the side of the path. She was right behind, just a few steps away, following him. He hadn't even heard her footsteps. A sudden dread turned his feet heavy as if they were tied with iron chains. Terror gripped his heart. To overcome his fear, he tried rationalizing. She was perhaps seeking company. Perhaps she was coming back from an errand and had missed her bus. She was lonely and scared. Then his numbed senses began to awaken from an errand at 2 o'clock at night. Was it normal for a woman to be out at the time when the bravest of males would be scared stiff to venture out in a lonely, deserted jungle like this? His heart began to pound against his chest. There was still no sign of human dwelling. They were surrounded by nothing but a silent, foreboding forest. Her presence didn't make sense. Nandi felt goosebumps on his arms. He needed to confirm if she was a woman, a human. He turned slightly to glance her. Her loose hair blew as if in a gust. She was wearing a loose and long pale colored t-shirt. It fluttered, but she wasn't enough breeze. Loose hair and loose dress. Narendra Singh had mentioned exactly such an apparition. Nandi felt suffocated. He gasped to breathe. Was she the same ghost he had she traveled with him in the truck? He was frantic with horror and terror. She turned to glance at her again. His glance lingered as if he pulled by a magnet. In that dim moonlight she looked exquisite, and her vision seemed directly rested on him. Why was she following him and smiling? Her nearness sent his legs trembling and heartbeats soaring. Her vision, through what appeared two dark circles in the dim light, pierced through him, as if she could read his mind, feed on his fear. He drew in a quick breath and quickly turned to look ahead. What kind of entity was she? Was she really a ghost? Nandi quivered to the thought. He shook his head. He was being silly, irrational, weak. He shouldn't have allowed those superstitious people to influence him. Perhaps she was really a local woman and was thankful for his company. She might have been lost in these deserted, lonely environs. Should he ask her? Did he have the guts to speak to her? Desrat's tale now raided his mind. The spirit of dead virgins seeking a mate. He couldn't help turning again. She was seductively at him. He must not look into her eyes. Desraj said that his son had made that mistake, had looked directly into the eyes of the ghost. He quickly turned his face and increased his pace on his shaky legs. He began to count steps and then curves he had executed. After 5 curves at that fast pace, he was gasping. Thousands of needles prickled his dry throat. He looked over his shoulder. She was still there, maintaining the same distance, matching his pace. He had taken such long strides. How was she managing that? No building was in sight yet. His agitation was making his head spin. He felt faint. Om, om, om. Was he on the right track? What if he had taken wrong route? What if Narendra Singh was mistaken? What if this path led deeper into the forest? Om, om. How long would she follow him? What did she want from him? The road seemed endless. The breeze became stronger, the trees began to sway, so did the shadows cast by them. They looked chilling, as if the whole area was getting filled with the wandering, moving spirits. They were slowly surrounding him, gagging him, trying to engulf him. He was a dead man. Would he be able to escape alive? Such intense fear was now new to Nandi. He began to run as fast as he possibly could on his shivering legs. He could hear the wheeze of his heavy panting. If it were a woman, she wouldn't be able to run like him uphill. He was sure. He was gasping. He had probably left her far behind. The thought gave him the courage to turn, to look back again, to confirm and to stop for a brief rest. She was right behind him, calm and relaxed. She paused and stood waiting. She appeared at least affected by the uphill run. There was no indication of her being breathless. Is she breathing at all? A spasm of shivers arose in his body. What is she? A body? A shape taken by a field of past energy? A shadow? What she once was? What does she want? Why is she following him? Please, God, save me. He turned and ran once again wildly, continuously chanting Om on his head. The humble pathway passing through a serene forest had become wickedly treacherous. It was calculatingly leading him to his wreck, he believed. He was at the peak of his desperation, executing curve after curve, each curve leading him to another. His destination seemed far, the road never ending. He was also frantic to shake her off. No matter how fast he ran, she effortlessly managed to maintain the same distance, as if she was being driven by some supernatural energy. She was going to do. How would she harm him? Nandi was fraught with anxiety. Did this frail looking thing have the power to exercise control over him? He was now sounding like an engine. Sweat was pouring down his forehead and seeping into his eyes, burning them. He didn't bother to take out his handkerchief from his pocket. He was focused on how to shake off this unearthly shadow and remain alive. It was getting so harrowing. He began to prepare mentally for an eventuality, for whatever was in store for him at this night. He was losing hope of ever reaching his brother's house. Narinder Singh had dropped him at the wrong place, he was sure. He had told him that the house was just a few curves ahead, a few minutes away, and here he was treading curve after curve with no sign of the building or a house anywhere. Should he turn and head back towards the road? But this creepy woman was behind him, obstructing the path. Moreover, what should he do on a lonely road with no chance of getting a lift? He was ensnared, lost, and mercy of his airy woman. Around the next turn, a large building suddenly loomed above him. Its appearance sent a wave of shock and relief at the same time, and made him stop in his tracks. He stood huffing and puffing. His chest was paining, his lungs almost bursting. The structure was much bigger than his expectations. He looked like a small castle from a fairy tale. A weak light bulb lit the veranda, otherwise, the place was completely dark, deserted, and encased in dim moonlight. The sight was the man-made structure was enough consolation. It was in all probability his deliverance. He had run really fast on the ledge. Could she still keep up with his pace? He looked back and was relieved to see no one was around. He heaved a sigh of relief. Being alone was so blissful. The solitude and darkness of the night were not as frightening. He scrutinized the building carefully. It was quite a big structure. He reached the steps leading to the veranda and climbed up a few. Then he hesitated. This was probably the institute. Where was the resident of the principal? He conducted a quick survey of the surrounding and spotted a cottage about 40 to 50 meters to his right. A narrow footpath curving around a small grassy hillock led to the cottage. Nandi retraced his step and followed the path. He was exceptionally alert, his eyes scrutinizing his surroundings, ready for any danger well in advance. The woman seemed to have disappeared, gone. What a relief! At last he had shaken her off. After all, she was human and lived here somewhere and had gone to her house. He had been pointlessly unnerved. He shook his head at his stupidity. He could have asked her where she lived. His shaky legs were slowly becoming steady. In 2 minutes he reached the steps leading to the veranda of the cottage. He covered all the steps in one giant leap. A few quick steps to cover the veranda and he reached the door. He dumped his bag down on the floor and knocked on the door. Nobody answered. Probably all were fast asleep. He banged louder, using both his fists. It remained absolutely quiet inside the cottage. Fear began to creep inside Nandi once again. There was something seriously wrong. It was then he saw an unusual big lock hanging on the door. He looked at the lock, dismay. Why didn't anyone live here? He picked up his bag, turned to go back to the main building, and then froze. She stood right behind him, below the steps. Not a leaf stirred, but her hair blew in gusts. Her piercing dark gaze was fixedly focused on him. An enticing smile played on her lips. He stood paralyzed, his mouth agape, his heart racing once again. Were those eyes or just holes imitating terrifying energy? Though it was at the back of his mind, the reality hit him now. She was no human, she was a wandering ghost. But why was she after him? He felt a tight, painful knot on his stomach. And then he felt the stab, a hard job on his chest. What was she doing to him? Oh God, his first loud words appeared to hit the woman like someone weapon, and she staggered. An angry expression replaced her scornful smile. Her features became grotesque, the beauty instantly lost in malice. It was the weirdest, scariest vision. Nandi was shivering wildly, gathering the last bit of his strength and holding his painful chest. He dashed towards the other side of the veranda, hopped down, hit the uneven ground, lost his balance, straightened, and then, in frantic long steps, ran towards the main building without a glance behind to know if she was still tailing him. To his reprieve, he could now see more light. Some now was standing at the top of the steps with a lantern in hand, peering down at his desperately running figure. Before breathless Nandi could utter a word, the man shouted, "Who are you? Stop! Don't move further." Nandi obeyed him. The man couldn't be displeased. He didn't want to be left alone with the airy woman. He stood still, at attention, his body shuddering in spasm. "Who are you? Where are you banging the door and creating ruckus at this hour?" I am the principal's brother. I got late. The bus, the bus I was traveling bus broke down." Nandi's throat was dry, his voice shaky. He was finding it difficult to speak. He swallowed hard and then, "Who are you?" "I am the night watchman Jharku." The voice was stern and gruff. Then softening his tone, he asked, "Are you Narendra Sahib?" "My Sahib was expecting you much earlier. He was worried." "Ah, at last." Nandi tried to smile but failed, still shaken after his brush with the ghost. "My bus was broke down. I got a lift in the army truck and reached here with great difficulty." Jharku raised his lamp to peer at his face closely. Sahib's brother. Then why was he so nervous and sweating? Nandi could perceive a friendly face, which then suddenly turned grave. "I am speaking the truth." But Jarku was not looking at him. His eyes were fixed on something behind him. Nandi instinctively turned to look back. The white spectre was moving, no floating back slowly away from them towards the cottage. He looked back at Jarku and noticed the large wooden stick in his hand raised, ready for use. The sight of the simple weapon was much consolation to Nandi, as was the reassuring presence of night watchmen. He took a few steps towards Jharku to be closer to a human. "There's someone with you?" Jharku sounded amazed. "Don't look her." "But Sahib said you aren't married." He was evidently outraged. "No, not a human. Ghost." Jharku's eyes expanded in fear. He raised his lantern high. "She's gone," he whispered. After a stretched silence broken only by sounds of their breathing, Jharku lowered his lantern and loudly blew out his breath. Who else could be out in the middle of the night? He then brought his lantern in level with Nandi's face, intently scrutinizing him. Suspiciously, nervously. "I don't know, but she followed me right from down from the entrance, the gate." Hare Ram, Jai Hanuman," Jharku chanted loudly. "Let me in. I'm scared and tired." There was desperation in Nandi's voice. Jharku had begun to appear uncertain. "You wait here. Will contact Sahib and get his permission. I cannot allow just anybody into the residence, not at this hour." Nandi protested. "I am Sahib's brother. He is expecting me. Not this late," Jharku stated firmly and turned to go. Nandi frantically followed him, the door with Jharku blocked. "Leave the lantern with me. I don't like the darkness." And your lathi too, please, Nandi pleaded. Jharku considered for a moment, hesitated, then finally handed Nandi the lantern. He kept his weapon with him. He wasn't sure he could trust any outsider now, not after what he had seen. She definitely looked more like a ghost than a living being. He then quickly took out a bunch of keys from his pocket, unlocked the door, and disappeared inside the building, closing the door behind him. Nandi heard the click of a door being locked from inside. While Jharku was away to inform the boss of the arrival of a stranger claiming to be his brother, Nandi was about to have nervous breakdown. Why was the ghost after him? What did she want? Please, God, save me now. For once, keep this horrible entity away. He raised the kerosene lantern towards where the ghost was last seen, hoping the hot burning fire would keep her away. But he refused to even glance in that direction. He waited on his trembling legs facing the door and reciting Hanuman Chalisa in his shivering voice. भूत पिशाच निकट नहीं आवे महावीर जब नाम सुनावे. Ghosts and jinns dare not come here when you recite the name of God Hanuman. Why was the night watchman taking hours to return, or would he return? Why did the ghost woman bother this man? He stayed out throughout the night, didn't he? Or was he a ghost too? What if it's a ghost castle? Would he be allowed to live? Or was he already a dead man, a ghost? Jai Hanuman Gyan Gun Sagar. The door suddenly opened wide to the smiling countenance of his brother. Jharku retrieved the lantern from Nandi's hand as he fell into his brother's open arms with a cry of relief. His brother chided him. At last, Nandi didn't. I tell you to board an early bus, but you just wouldn't. His brother stopped midway, and what was wrong with Nandi? Why was he trembling and sobbing like a child? Jharku stood up guard behind them and his kerosene lantern raised and his lathi ready for defense. He was peering into the dark void of the light, mumbling prayers, but he was unsure if any of those things would work on the ghostly entity he had just seen. So, this is all for today. See you later with new updates. Thank you so much for watching.